Yeah, my name's Sally Jenkinson. I'm S. Jenkinson on Twitter if you want to get hold of me. And I work as a consultant and solutions architect through my very small company, Records Sound the Same. And we help people like these with everything from their research and their discovery, their solutions architecture, and quite a lot of transformation work, very often trying to improve older processes and systems. And I do indeed want to talk to you today about working with the future. And the web has really been evolving an awful lot since its inception. Our technologies are constantly shifting, which I'm sure is something that we're all kind of facing at the moment. And today is pretty good. I think we're in quite an amazing place, but it's going to be even more amazing 5 years into the future. So I want to jump ahead to the internet of 2021 and give you a sneak preview. Wow. A good question. I'm really sorry I have to stop it there. It is brilliant. If you would like to watch more, that is a clip from the 1995 film, Johnny Mnemonic, which is based very loosely on a short story by William Gibson. Some of you may have seen it. But I'm a real fan of this film, not only because it's just awful but brilliant at the same time, but because it's a great example of the challenges that we face when we try and work with the future whilst also being firmly grounded in the realities of our present. And the film's pretty well known. It's kind of one of those cult classics. And unsurprisingly, nowadays, you can find it in a lot of places online. And for once, the best thing about this is actually the YouTube comments, which is a rare thing to be able to say. And so you get people making lots of observations like this. And what's really interesting is that most of the commenters don't actually focus on the interface itself. So we're probably all so used to our kind of flat, clean, medium-esque designs that this kind of terrifying visual aesthetic and hand-waving is just dismissed out of hand. But lots of people are talking about the hardware. And so there's comparisons with things like Google Glass and Oculus Rift. And a fun fact is the visor that Johnny's wearing is actually called a Thompson iPhone. So that gets mentioned quite a lot. The nerds among us might also know that the gloves that he was wearing are a real product, and they became the much maligned Nintendo Power Glove for anybody who had one of those or didn't. I think the two people. But what gets missed out is very often the things that we now take for granted. So just at the end of that clip, there was actually a really quick live translation feature, which is pretty amazing. And we just gloss over that. We kind of accept that kind of stuff now. And so we've also got the forward-thinking stylization balanced with things like this. So nobody could possibly imagine that we could ever get past dial-up, for instance. And this is a trend that we really see over and over again with everything from sci-fi through to, this is a 19th century chocolate box piece of art by a German chocolate company. And in it, they basically created this series of what life might be like in the year 2000. And as you can see, there's these really futuristic scenarios of us walking on water, but that could only come about through the way, or through the means that they could actually comprehend at the time. So in this case, it's the air balloons, and you might be able to see these really weird little canoe shoes that they're all wearing as well. So that didn't happen, sadly. But that's really the challenge. So how do we work with the future whilst being constrained by the realities of our present? And more to the point, why do we want to work with the future? But to answer that, we first need to understand the challenges that the future brings us and our clients, both in the immediacy, the near future, and beyond. So this is a white elephant, and white elephants were actually kept as status symbols by Southeast Asian monarchs. And they're considered sacred. And if you've done something really amazing, the monarch might actually gift you a white elephant. But the problem with that is it's obviously quite difficult. I'm not sure if we could all, just accept a gift of an elephant and house it and feed it. But the problem is, alongside the practicalities, they were also, because they were sacred, they were protected from labour. So you end up with this really expensive thing that's actually kind of useless, and you can't just get rid of it or put it in a drawer and bring it out when he comes round for tea. So in the West, we often end up using this term to refer to an expensive burden that fails to live up to expectations or deliver. So nobody wants to end up with a white elephant, least of all as our websites. The problem is, though, what we plan now may not necessarily be relevant in the future. So our early conversations with clients are often focused on the benefits that we know that our work can bring, and how well we understand their needs, and perhaps putting together solutions that demonstrate how well we can meet their needs. And I hope, because we're all at this conference, we usually build in some kind of a short-term mentality, some kind of an awareness that things are going to change. But the reality is an awful lot can change. So we really have to consider the timelines of everything else involved, which can go from the changing needs and expectations of our users through to the wider business, its strategy, technology trends, so how we make things, how people use things, what's available, what works and what doesn't. And then wildcards. So this could be anything from, say, a terrorist attack, crashing the global economy and wiping out the budget that we had planned in for the next 2 years, through to alien landings or whatever it might be. These are things completely outside of the scope of what we typically expect. So thinking in a more agile way can really help with this. But there's actually a lot more that we can do when we think about the future. And this is a view that's shared by the Future Friendly movement, who I'm sure lots of you have probably heard of. You might have seen sort of T-shirts with the logo on. But this is on their website. It was all put together in 2012. And it's something that still holds true today, in the future, for when it was originally created. So what all of us do probably work in the future daily already. We anticipate new browser releases, new devices. We might check support through sites like this. We might do some light bedtime reading in terms of looking through ever-changing specs and things like that. And then we come to conferences and we hear what can and can't be done and what we should be doing. And we hopefully know that we can't actually control who is using our website or what devices they use, what the capabilities are, what they might be in the future. So responsive design and concepts like progressive enhancement have done a lot in this area. But those are all choices that we as professionals need to make. So as the people who make websites and who run websites, we need to make decisions. And like the people of the past, we're balancing those realities of today with the unknowns of tomorrow. Once we start making decisions, we need to be really mindful that even if they're not quite right, even if they are quite right for us now, then in the future, they may not necessarily be in every situation. And people who make software and make these decisions are really scared of that. They don't want to be the one that chose wrong or to end up with this white elephant that they're tied to and which limits the company. But even initially good choices, as Paul's 2007 website shows, can end up as white elephants if we're not careful. So I spent 3 months last year working as a digital specialist with one of the UK's big energy companies. And they'd got into this situation where their internal systems were actually over 20 years old. And they'd initially done a fantastic job. But nowadays, they were really struggling to meet up with both the internal business and the customer needs. And so there was this huge amount of technical debt. I'm sure you've kind of all heard of similar projects. They struggled to get developers that could actually specialize in the technologies because they were kind of out of fashion now. And the painful thing to admit for them was that any changes, whether it was kind of compliance they had to do or just nice to haves, took 6 months to happen. So that was awful. Once you fall behind like this, it really doesn't matter what methodology you're doing or what you're trying to do, what methodology you're using, because all of these limitations you're facing will basically drown you. There'll be this elephant crushing you. It's really easy at this point to feel like you need to just take the elephant, get rid of it, start again. Because all you're doing at the moment is trying to kind of keep up, but really you want to be getting ahead. You want to be doing innovative stuff and beating all of your competitors. So my client had got into that fabled cycle of it's all broken, we have to throw it all out and start again, which in theory is great because clean slate and all that, but in practice that's absolutely terrifying for people to do. And they'd fallen into this trap of forgetting all of the good things that the system had done for them. And instead kind of focused on how overwhelming everything was, how fearful they were of doing the same thing again, which meant that we were tasked with coming up with solutions that would be able to meet their needs for the next 5 to 10 years. To which a lot of people's reaction was something like this. But when businesses do fall behind, they do often feel the need to do these kind of large transformation projects, which are often kind of seen as quite enterprisey. They might be high budget, high risk and high pressure and high stress, because essentially a lot of them are going to be changing the fundamentals of the whole business. But actually, this isn't just an enterprise or big business thing. It's something that applies to everybody. Because without an eye on the future and a willingness to keep up with this regular evolution, the pressure of any kind of change can feel really scary indeed, even to smaller businesses or people who are used to kind of making changes. And so there is this bad, throw it all out to me, and then there's also the good that comes from constant transformation and always thinking about the future. But of course, it's not just project problems. So a lot of the challenges around the future actually present themselves to us as individuals as well, because it's really, really easy to feel overwhelmed. And I'm sure I'm probably not alone here with that. But it's hard because sometimes you can feel like you've got a lack of knowledge of everything that's out there already. And there's so many books to read and blog posts and everything else. And trying to keep up with what isn't even here yet is just a bit of a nightmare. So as somebody who needs a website, if you don't consider the things that we've talked about, the evolution in the long and the short term, then you might run the risk of having this white elephant, of falling into these traps. But as somebody who makes websites, not thinking about the future can also maybe lead you to be one of the people responsible for getting the project into that state. Or you might be blindsided or sort of derailed by change. Or hopefully you wouldn't actually get so far back that you get left behind and start becoming undesirable as a professional. The future's really hard, it is. But luckily, due to the very nature of time itself, people have already been dealing with this for a very long time. And one of the wonderful things about technology as we experience it in the present is that at some point in the past, it didn't exist. And it may only have been a concept in fantastic stories. And so we can really draw on this with our thinking about the future and try to get it to help us in our work. So this image is actually from a 1930s German magazine, and it's one of the first things that I pulled together when I started thinking about this talk. And in it, again, you can see the combinations of the known and the futuristic. So the primary focus seems to be some kind of what I assume is a video chat application. But we've also got at the top what might be some kind of personal flying vehicle. But the question that springs to mind for me is, which are the goggles related to, or are they just fashion items? Because if it's an enclosed vehicle, you shouldn't need them. But they don't appear to be tied into this in any way. So you've got kind of the known technologies, like the goggles, like wires, like a little receiver for sound there. Got a box, which has got a little knob, which might be for volume. But we also have unknowns, so future elements that they may not have fully considered when they're kind of coming up with this illustration. So how do we actually select the recipient of our call? How do how does it connect? And most importantly, as we all know, they're having a lovely time in bright sunlight, and that's really hard to get right. So congrats to them for getting that right so early. But many things like video calling or tablets or ebooks are actually really frequently seen in sci-fi in particular. But there's actually a reference to video calling right back in an incredibly early version of Beauty and the Beast. So again, things that are really familiar to us today, but have popped up all the time in fantasy. We've got another retro futurism image here called Subways of the Future. And thankfully this, again, wasn't predicting our fashion choices. It's a common theme here. But it comes with the caption, subways of the future will almost be noiseless and will make present subterranean transport systems seem snail slow. Pneumatically propelled gravity vacuum tube capsules will run underground at 240 miles per hour. And when we compare this to visions of what people like the Tesla company are trying to do, it's hard not to draw parallels. So I don't know if you know, but they basically have a project called Hyperloop. And this aims to basically try to solve kind of mass rapid transport between what they call kind of high traffic city pairs. So you've got Los Angeles and San Francisco, these little pods going between it. And rather than 240 miles per hour, they're looking at more like 700. And just because we can dream it up, as their documentation details, solutions aren't always forthcoming when we start to deal in reality. So the pneumatic vision that we saw on the previous slide wouldn't actually be possible. They've looked into that. But the documentation does detail what might be if you want to have a look. So it's only kind of with experience and with hindsight that we can start to identify these limitations from things that we now know. However, that doesn't mean that dreaming of the future is a pointless activity. So quite the opposite. Stories can really help us give some human context to technology. So how's it used? What problems might it have? And how might people actually react to it if it's out there? We can use stories or science fiction to help us better understand the technology in a wide sense, as well as to envision these implications of its use and to be better prepared for the future. So there's a whole school of thought called design fiction, which addresses exactly this, and it's a method of critical design that uses stories to raise questions about possible futures for design and the society. So you can use the mentality to work through the benefits, the challenges, and the implications of a new idea, and to imagine it in a human-driven context rather than a purely engineering-led scenario. And so this is really pretty much what we think about in terms of UX. It's exactly the same kind of focus, but this in particular has an eye on the future. And there's some really nice enablers in this space that you might want to have a look at. So these are some cards. They're called Design Fiction Product Work Kit by Near Future Laboratory. And as you can see, they're challenged to think with different scenarios in mind when you're actually planning a product. And what they want you to do is to tell stories, to play around with ideas. And also, as I mentioned, to explore the wider impacts. So we've got social, we've got technological, environmental, economic, and political. And what I really like about something like this is that it's extremely accessible to people who are not technical, not kind of, in this world. So it makes it great for things like workshops. And it can really allow people to kind of think out of their everyday constraints and their specific situations that they find themselves in. So a nice activity to do is to take a sort of futuristic scenario and to talk about it, how you might actually build it with things that are around today, what things don't exist, but how they might exist. And if you actually start to ask people about the future itself, they open up a lot more because they often project a lot of things on the future, whether it's their hopes or their dreams and their fears. And if you ask them about the future rather than their current situation, they very often tell you more than they would otherwise. But the important thing here is to think about why the ideas are actually successful. So to start to break them down into really atomic components. And I think a lot of us are hopefully used to kind of working in a way now where we do think in terms of components, we think very atomically. But it's finding that one thing that makes the idea really successful around, with all the stories around it. That's what we want to get to. We can also see future thinking through other influences too. So one of the most obvious parallels that we can draw between something like sci-fi and the web is when we consider interfaces and the means to actually interact with systems. There's been an excellent study, and one that I wish I'd done, undertaken by a chap called Christopher Noessel, and he's got a website called Sci-Fi Interfaces and a book called Make It So. And in it, what he's basically done is to go away and watch a lot of sci-fi, whether that's TV or films, and he's analysed every single interface that can be found within it. And they look at absolutely everything from mechanical controls to visual interfaces, gesture, communication, so much more. But what they do is they take that and they collect together at the end a set of really practical guidelines that we can actually all apply to our projects. So as they state in the conclusion, there's a bit of a spoiler, but we've seen repeatedly that if an interface works for an audience, there's something there that will work for users. Finding what that thing is and using it for inspiration in our own work is part of how we can use these speculative interfaces. And an example they have in the book, which I've completely stolen, is on the original Star Trek. Basically, on the bridge, they had these control panels. So they had these like little plastic gems and buttons. And when it came to trying to re-envisage those sets for Star Trek The Next Generation, they wanted something that looked quite cool and futuristic, but they also had some really tight budgetary constraints. So this was actually quite expensive in terms of all the different bits. The solution they came up with is one that's really quite famous now. It's called LCARS. That's kind of the general term for it. But what they did was to basically take a load of acetate, print stuff on it, and put a backlight up. So really cheap. And it was really usable because it was this, big touchscreeny thing. And they ended up being sort of, something that really popularized that concept of touchscreen. And that's an important point. Through our choices, through the things that we sort of put out there in the world, we can actually shape the future of technology itself and what people come to use. So by aiming to anticipate the future, we can hopefully do all of this much better. We can better support our users, we can create better, much more sustainable things, and we can try to shape technologies themselves. But how are we going to do that? Well, first, I think the most important point here is that, as we all hopefully know from Back to the future isn't any one point in time. So there might be, it's a constant spectrum, basically. There might be different futures for all of us as well. So our future here in Poland might be very different to other places in the world. And it's also going to vary in terms of the different elements of our projects. So Kathleen had a very similar diagram to this and puts my poor design skills to shame. But on a conceptual kind of basis, our evolutionary focus might end up looking something a little bit like this. So we have a shorter lifespan, meaning much more regular assessment and updating, and a longer lifespan down the bottom, being elements that play much more into our larger strategic thoughts. What we don't want to do is get too caught up in the constant change that we actually don't think about any of this stuff at all. So typically, elements of our projects that people interact with are going to have a shorter lifespan than the technologies that power them. So expectations and conventions and progress on the web all mean that our designs and our front-end interfaces can and should be evolved probably much more rapidly to meet changing situations. And that's not to say that back-end shouldn't or can't, but it simply means that these core elements are less likely to need evolving on the same scale. And please note, as ever, I use user interfaces as a very loose term, so this isn't just public user interfaces, it's content management system interfaces, it's admin sort of little terrible tools on screens that have come up. But let's think about the actions that we might want to take. So, very simple thing, we've got a form, we're going to enter a number into it, and we're going to store that somewhere. So traditionally, that'll probably be through direct text input, probably from a keyboard. But now, of course, we've got virtual keyboards, touch keyboards, and we might maybe make them a little bit nicer in terms of we could use HTML5 input types maybe, but generally it's kind of the same. But then what about voice? Or maybe we want the ability to do some character recognition and sort of capture that number that way. And maybe that's through a phone or a camera, or maybe it's through the internet-enabled retinal implants that we're all going to have in 5 years' time when the internet is amazing. But fundamentally, our back end is going to stay the same because we're storing a number. And the service to capture and validate that probably stays the same. And what's different is the way that we present the interaction to the user and how the capabilities that we offer them actually may come and go. And so the concept of zero UI, or no interface, is quite an interesting one. This is something that's becoming a bit more popular. So this is, as it says, aiming to kind of remove barriers to make it more natural to interact with systems. So you might have things like body motions, gestures, words, or maybe even thoughts, who knows. So that's our kind of interfaces, but when we move down, we start to move into looking at sort of features and integrations. So maybe we've integrated with a payment provider who's the only one that can do the feature that we need at the moment, but then a competitor comes along who does it better. You want to have thought about this so that your architecture and your dependencies are able to cope as much as possible with the switch. So trying to kind of go towards a decoupled or service-led architecture can go some way towards helping with that. But then you've also got the core kind of digital components, as I call them. So these are systems which are very digital-led. So things like content management systems or mailing systems or analytics. We're probably not going to be changing those very often. But when we do, the change will be a little bit harder than what's come before. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to rewrite everything from scratch here upwards, though. So try to ensure that your choices here aren't going to be restricting the change at the other areas. And then finally, what I'm terming the kind of core back-end systems, these are, they're not exclusively digital, they're much more far-reaching. So they're business-wide accountancy systems or billing systems or booking systems, and they're really going to rarely change. The impact of change is going to be felt much, much wider. And if your choices here don't work, then that can hurt. It's not the kind of thing that you can just go, oh, you know, we'll just swap that out quickly in the next sprint. It's all fine. So minimizing the impact of change here is actually very much a lot about culture and attitudes and process. And so this concept of the different levels of the future is particularly important. We need to think about our next sprint, next month, next 6 months, and 10 years' time, all at the same time when we think about our strategy, because this is all the future of our projects. And in the next few slides, I want to quickly take you through how I see some of the points I've raised today applying to our work. So slides will be online. I know you can all snap away if you need to. But this is probably a mix of things you're already doing and things that we've maybe talked about today. So you want to start with the big picture whenever you're doing your discovery or your planning. This is the distant future all the way through to tomorrow. One of the most difficult things you'll have is trying to get people to think on these different levels and trying to think big picture when all they want to do is just deliver that thing tomorrow to get it off their list. So the mindset of people is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. This is an example of how I've sort of tried to help that in the past. I don't think you can see it very well. It's basically a set of principles that were created. So when you're trying to get people to constantly think about the future and think about why they're doing something, if you create a set of principles that everything, again, comes back to in the same way that you do with other areas, that can be really powerful for making sure that you're always validating what you're doing. I also really like this quote, which I think is something to think about when we actually put together our requirements. So, as with some of the design fiction cards and the wider impacts, we need to think about actually whether we're focusing on quite the right things. So when it comes to actually doing, as I'm sure we all know, shortening the future really reduces those unknowns. So we want to try and do that. But then if you remove your connection to now and you think about what could be, that's also really important too, because if we only live right here in the now with the limitations and the frustrations, then we run the risk of never pushing our solutions and also never thinking about the bottom layers. And now, obviously, we don't just stop when we deliver something, hopefully. And obviously, the point of evolution is that everything up to this point, in terms of the mindset and the planning and the building, won't matter if you can't keep up with change that happens anyway. So all of those arrows that are going on. So we want to keep one eye on the future, but we also want to keep one eye on the past as well. I want to educate people about why the future might be important and how, most importantly, change doesn't have to mean failure. It's something that will happen. We want to play with new technologies as well. And as an individual, this can be really powerful because maybe something's not quite right to put in your project or launch it quite yet. But that doesn't mean that you can't be the one to know about it and talk about it and blog about it. And then maybe when it is, you can be right there, ready to put it in. So, to wrap up, I'm English, I like tea. I particularly like jasmine tea, that's my thing. I'm sure you're all ready for one. But I was actually at a conference last year where a gentleman called Andrew Pendrick told a story about tea. because he was talking about the concept of wabi-sabi, which is a really quite hard to translate Japanese phrase. And it basically describes a mindset of accepting transience and imperfection. And one of the examples given is the glaze on a teacup that kind of chips over time or maybe gets these cracks. And it can be quite beautiful. You can see in other places like changing autumn leaves. But I think it's also particularly relevant to our work on the internet as well, because both transience and imperfection and the beauty that they can bring is part of what makes the internet great. So we should design and build what we know, but we should stay flexible enough to change. We can make predictions, but we shouldn't wed ourselves to them. We can actually shape the web to meet our needs, and we can change how people think about it in the future too. By accepting change as a necessity in projects and by not seeing it as failure that we've maybe gone down a different path, then we can start to identify the opportunities instead. Don't just see the unknowns and imperfections as something to be battled against, but try to embrace them a little bit. As my wise friend John says, don't plan for the future because there is no future. There's just now and a series of next nows. So if you try to embrace this fluidity, hopefully your projects will be a little bit better for it. Thank you very much.